Hi, welcome back to Uncommon Sense. I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia.
And I'm Alexis Hutrong in Ottawa, Canada. As ever, this comes to you from the Sociological Review, and our aim remains the same: to freeze an everyday concept or notion we tend to think we understand, and to see it from a sharper angle, to see it differently, more critically, and more sociologically.
Today, it's time to talk about the idea of being spiritual. And what a powerful, loaded word that is. I mean, for me, as a sociologist of religion, I am loath to jump into definitions because we argue about it all the time. But in my personal life, I guess I associate spirituality with yoga, which I did for quite a while in a studio that was very fond of chanting and singing. Alexis, what does that word mean to you? Would you describe yourself as spiritual?
I guess I'd say so, but to be honest, if I'm thinking of spirituality as linked to religion, for example, before turning 18, I think I prayed every single night, actually.
Wow.
But then my brother passed away, as I mentioned on this show before. And I remember stopping completely, maybe out of anger or sadness or something like that. And since then, I've also felt desire to commune with something bigger, especially in difficult situations. But I'm never quite sure what that is. And but I guess it's something that could be experienced as being spiritual in some way.
Well, our guest today is, like me, a sociologist of religion, and heads up, he is someone that I have worked with. He's Andrew Singleton, based at Deakin University in Victoria, Australia. And besides spirituality, he's interested in subjects like young people and, of course, religion. Recently, he's researched spiritualism, which I guess you could call a religious movement from the 19th century based on the idea that the dead can interact with the living. And in fact, word has it, Andrew even knows his way around a Ouija board.
Hi, Andrew. Welcome.
That's right.
So is that true? What Rosie just said about the Ouija boards?
Yeah, in the course of doing my research on spiritualism, I've definitely engaged in some practices that spiritualists use in order to contact the dead. And so that sometimes involves a Ouija board. So you rest your hands gently on the board and try and get the little planchette to spell out letters. It can go quite slowly and be quite chaotic, but it does work. I don't think there's a spiritual cause behind it. I think there's a kind of more material explanation. And I've also done table tipping, where you rest your hands gently on a table and it sort of rocks and sways as well, kind of as if guided by the spirits. So it's been a very exciting research project to do that with my friend and colleague Matt Tomlinson at the ANU.
That project just sounds like too much fun. I want to ask what actually brought you to the sociology of religion, which I don't know if I've ever actually asked you. I mean, I think it's often assumed that people in our field have some kind of wild backstory, maybe a religious upbringing or conversion or quitting a religious community, maybe, fleeing some kind of cult or something.
If you describe the Anglican Church in the 1970s and 80s in Australia as a cult, then I've escaped a cult. But I think it's much more prosaic than that. It was definitely part of my life as a teenager, and it was a really amazing sort of sense of community when I was growing up in the suburbs of Melbourne, and my mum in particular was and still is very religious. And so I was always sort of interested in academic study of religion. So when I went to uni, I took the sociology of religion with our colleague, Gary Baumer, rest in peace, Gary, and he was an amazing pioneering sociologist of religion at Monash University, where I did my undergraduate degree. And I was just so sort of taken by his sociological way of thinking about religion. I became a student of it and did my PhD in it. My PhD was looking about how Pentecostals tell stories about unusual and miraculous experiences, which I found really interesting.
Yeah.
But then after finishing my PhD, I started sort of doing stuff around men and housework, because that was sort of some research opportunities and teaching opportunities, which was really boring because there's only so many ways you can explain why men won't do more housework. And so I sort of turned back to the sociology of religion with the opportunity to do a project on youth religion and spirituality about 20 years ago.
And you, Andrew, would you call yourself spiritual?
Alexis, that's a really great question, because I do things that people think are spiritual, but I don't put that label on them myself. So for a sense of well-being and balance, I meditate every day. I get up and sit on my cushion for 30 minutes and concentrate on my breath in mindful practice, which of course is sort of indebted to the Buddhist tradition, and very popular now here in the global north. I do yoga about 4 times a week, which of course comes out of the Hindu tradition, again is very popular for better or worse in the global north. But for me, I see that as about health, well-being, longevity, balance, those kinds of things. I don't see them as spiritual. I was lying there in yoga class the other morning, 6:30. It was really cold, and they were talking about the 8 limbs of yoga and using Sanskrit names to describe that. And I thought, I'm really cold. I just got to start rocking some downward dogs. So can we hurry up? So yeah, I do stuff, but for me, in a classic kind of contemporary way, my label was not spiritual for that stuff.
Well, I mean, I've been really looking forward to this conversation because there's loads of layers of common sense around spirituality that we can kind of hack away at today. So, first up, perhaps that it's the more individualistic, malleable, loose bedfellow, let's say, of religion, which, by contrast is seen, therefore, as kind of fixed and rigid. But second, and especially recently, I think maybe there's a common sense assumption out there that spirituality is just this kind of cynical thing that's been commodified and is now just all about, wellness and celebrity and big business. And I don't know, that kind of feels like the cool intellectual hot take on spirituality. So we're going to dig into that later too. But, let's start with the tricky thing called definitions. Andrew, how has spirituality typically been defined by those sociologists who you read for your work? And how has the sociology of religion made space for talking about spirituality?
What a great thing to talk about. I guess the sort of the origin of spirituality lies, religion is its bedfellow. And for the longest time, it was kind of seen as an element of, say, religion. So if we think of religion as being like belief, ritual, myth, doctrine, community, and organisation, they're all kind of elements that we see in most religious traditions, whether it's the Abrahamic religious traditions or even religious traditions coming out of the global south. But there's also, in all of that, like a personal interior dimension to religion. So you might pray or meditate or dance or sing in a religious context and have a kind of experience of transcendence, a moment where you're lifted out of yourself, either because you connect with the others around you or because you connect with that deity that you're worshipping. So that has historically been called spirituality. But increasingly, that dimension seems to be disentangled from all the other bits of religion. And so this sort of chasing something or searching for something interior and personal and affective, I think now is called spirituality.
What about beyond the global north? How have sociologists of religion kind of spoken about spirituality in those other contexts?
There's been a real kind of debate, particularly in anthropology in recent years, about the fact that, a lot of what's understood to be religion and spirituality is kind of sort of Western definitions. And in fact, this whole idea of practices that were part of community and life in South Asia weren't even thought to be religion until sort of Protestant and Catholic Christians turned up and said, hey, that looks similar or that shares similarities with what we think is religion, and labelling as religion for those communities that wasn't even thought of in that way. And a lot of practices that we now describe as spiritual here in the global north actually are kind of embedded in life and cultural practices in South Asia, such as meditation and yoga. So in a way, those kinds of understanding that stuff as spirituality and religion doesn't necessarily hold with the way those practices and things are understood in those cultures.
What you just spoke about kind of like touches on the definitions, like in academia and theory and so on. But to echo on what you just said about what happens kind of like in the real world or something like that. And if we turn to countries like Australia or Canada, we've had what was called like a spiritual turn with its roots, but not necessarily its earliest roots in the 1960s, counterculture movement in the US and so on. it's a culture that was kind of documented by people like Joan Didier and Hunter S. Thompson and the like. Can you tell me about that and the place of the hippie movement in all of this and how it brought us to today?
I guess to give the starting point to that question, I recently looked at some data about how religious Australians were in the early 1960s. And one of the things that struck me was, even if people didn't have a whole lot of, say, Christian practice, because Christianity was the predominant religion of Australia at that time, it was still kind of the touchstone for culture. It's like you had to have a religious identity because everyone did. You had to kind of have some nod towards going to church at least twice a year because that's what people did in the community. It was a kind of focal point for social life. And I think that the spiritual turn began in the 1960s when the young people who were born immediately after World War I and World War II, and that so-called baby boom, kind of became tired of that way of organising society because they saw that it hadn't brought that much good in terms of, it had led to, those traditions had led to like the Vietnam War and World War II and all of that stuff. And so there's an exploration for meaning and spirituality outside of what had previously existed in Western culture. And part of that was to turn first and foremost to South Asian religions, Hinduism and Buddhism in particular. And I think that was the start of the spiritual turn in the 1960s.
Was that kind of like the birth of what you might call the spiritual marketplace?
Yeah. The idea, when you think of the Beatles, when they went off to India, it sort of seems so innocent as they're there and they're dressing up in that way and sort of looking for enlightenment. But I guess capitalism comes along and kind of co-opts everything. And so the spiritual marketplace sort of enveloped a whole lot of ideas and then started to market that to us and sell it to us as commodities that can be accessed. Beginning with, I suppose, the wellness movement in the 1970s and then the emergence of the New Age, which is very much about sort of client and product. And so now the spiritual marketplaces, there's a range of options that we can engage in. And a lot of them cost some kind of money, so hence the marketplace.
Okay, so expanding on that story of the spiritual turn and looking even more beyond the global north, I know you spent a lot of time in Papua New Guinea some years ago. Has the same kind of turn happened there?
The sort of the spiritual turn that's taken place in Papua New Guinea is different, and yet some of the elements are quite the same in the sense that people are looking for a kind of spiritual engagement that sort of enriches their life. Prior to white colonization in Papua New Guinea, there was indigenous religions and indigenous spiritualities which were very much connected to place and land. So I've been in the highlands of PNG and walking with nationals, and they'll say, look, there's, spirit is imbued in this place and this rock and this tree, etc., etc. And then, of course, Christianity kind of got imposed on the local culture, and that was, either traditional mainline Protestant Christianity or Catholicism. But in recent years, the religious form that's gone gangbusters in Papua New Guinea is Pentecostalism, and it kind of presents itself as this kind of alive and energetic alternative to mainstream religion. And part of that is connecting with the self and transforming the self, and you can experience betterment through the Holy Spirit. And so kind of the biggest show in town now is Pentecostalism. So in the highlands of PNG, in the town that I lived in about 10 years ago, there's Pentecostal churches were sort of mushrooming all over town. And on a Saturday and Sunday morning, anyone with, a loudspeaker seemed to be able to establish a new congregation. And it was amazing. And in a way, I think some of the energy for that that movement was the same sort of drive for a spirituality that's personal, affective and transformative here and now, and not staid and based on old-fashioned structures.
It's interesting because I feel like Pentecostalism and kind of charismatic Christianity is such a big thing globally. It's in Africa and Latin America as well. It's huge. And it's doing these things that in the global north, we seem to be turning to these kind of spiritual, non-religious things. But this is Christianity doing it in these other contexts. Do you have any reflection on why it's appealing to people in those places?
I guess the promise of religion in medieval times was a great afterlife because life in the here and now was so miserable if you're a peasant or a serf. The afterlife was the great promise, but now we're looking for lives that are fulfilled, engaged, and meaningful. And Pentecostalism, in a way, it's kind of a very vibrant sort of spirituality because it focuses in on an affective relationship with the Holy Spirit that transforms you here and now. And I think a lot of the themes of contemporary spirituality in the global north is the same. We're not waiting for the great hereafter.
Yeah.
We're engaged now for betterment, prosperity, wellness, health.
Moving forward, it kind of seems from your work that the spiritual turn we talked about just now has certainly been powerful in Australia. Like you've done research on young people and belief, and many people would think that there was rising secularization in many Western societies. And in some ways, that's kind of true. But your research also found that many young people actually aren't as nihilistic as their elders might assume. And they do believe in something. Actually, they're kind of like, I think you said like seekers or spiritual, but not religious. Can you explain those terms and kind of give us a picture of who such young people might be?
I guess rising secularism now, and broadly in sociology of religion, we might think of like rising splintering in the sense that there's a strong current of secular thinking and secular approaches to life being non-religious in countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, and other parts of the global north. But at the same time, an enduring thread of interest in spirituality and also great cultural diversity, and now people from all across the world with religious and spiritual practices living in multicultural societies. So that study of young people was some project I did with some colleagues from ANU and Monash and Deakin University. And we were fortunate enough to be able to do about 4 or 5 years ago a national study of teenagers and religion and diversity. We call it Australia's Generation Z project. And really lucky and fortunate to be able to survey a representative sample of teenagers. And we came up with a formula for kind of sorting people into different categories, this kind of fancy pants statistics called latent class analysis, which is kind of, my spirituality. And we discovered about 6 different kind of worldviews or approaches to life. And there was, traditionally religious young people, whether they follow, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, or Buddhism or Hinduism. Then a group of young people who blend sort of eclectic spiritual practices with religious practices. We called them seekers. So they might be, say, someone who's raised Buddhist. However, they are interested in things like astrology and other practices that are not necessarily kind of within the Buddhist remit. Then a group who were interested in spirituality but not religion, so everything to do with traditional faith they rejected, but they were interested in astrology, horoscopes, belief in possibility of contacting the dead, reincarnation, and so on. We called those young people spiritual but not religious because in our survey they sort of said, yes, not only do I believe in these things, by the way, I identify with that label that you've given me, spiritual but not religious. They represented about 1 in 5 teenagers in Australia. So, and then the rest are all different levels of kind of like secular to super secular, atheist, and so on.
I mean, I find it, thinking about this term spiritual but not religious, that sort of came up as one of your categories. I don't know. I feel like I'm Generation Y, and I was talking about this with our producer Alice, who I think is also a Generation Y, and we were talking about the fact when we were kids, teenagers or even in university, saying that you were religious, kind of like, I don't know. I would say it brought some assumptions about who you were. Maybe wasn't the coolest thing to say, but calling someone spiritual didn't necessarily, someone who was spiritual or someone who was interested in like astrology or whatever, like that was fine. That's benign, right? There's nothing to it. So are our prejudices, still there in the Gen Z folk that you came across, or are they more open-minded than we were?
One of the beautiful things we discovered about teenagers is that they're very open-minded about whatever thing that you've got going, like that's cool for you, But, by the way, do not put that on me.
Yeah.
But I still think that the religious young people that we talked to and interviewed definitely talked about, feeling awkward, kind of keeping that part of themselves quiet. And in a lot of situations, they actually go to schools that encourage that, like, Pentecostal schools or Christian schools or Islamic schools. So they encounter other young people in like a school kind of way who are like them. But outside of that, no, it's something that they keep very quiet. Whereas I totally agree that sort of looking down on things like astrology or whatever, that just is not sort of subject to the same kind of ridicule and that religious teenagers describe experiencing here.
Listening to this as someone who isn't from Australia, right? I'm kind of wondering from your perspective, Andrew, do you feel that there's something here that's specific about Australia in terms of young people being at ease with spirituality or something like that?
The research on places like Canada and the United Kingdom shows similar sort of tendencies. The United States is its own kind of thing when it comes to religion because there's pockets where it's extremely religious and pockets where it's not. And one of the really unfortunate things in the sort of the sociological study of spirituality and religion in young people is a complete sort of absence of really kind of strong studies of places in the global south. So getting a really strong sense of, say, what it's like to be a teenager in relation to religion and spirituality in Papua New Guinea. We just have to rely on small qualitative research that kind of broader national picture of research does not yet exist. It does amongst adults, and there's organisations like the International Social Science Program that looks at all these kinds of practices across the globe. I still think with a kind of, a very Western-centric understanding of what constitutes religion and spirituality, but teenagers globally, it's still a great mystery.
It's kind of interesting. I haven't really thought about that, but as someone, that works on the Ontario side and that lives on the Quebec side, I know that like religion has kind of had a bit of a different history or evolved differently in Quebec and I'd say broadly elsewhere in Canada. So I'm kind of wondering also how that might be still like affecting, I guess, young people's experience of belief, spirituality, and so on.
But the research that I've seen around Canadian teens is they sort of pocket off Quebec because of the strong Catholic influence, which has been, strongly tied to aspects of cultural life there, and the more Anglo parts are kind of seen as sort of more, the similar patterns that you might see amongst, Australian teens or English teens and things like that.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to come back to you in a minute, but right now it's time for a word from our producer, Alice.
Hi, thanks for listening to Uncommon Sense, where we're talking to Andrew Singleton about spirituality. This is the penultimate episode of Season 2, where we've looked at things ranging from taste to performance, anxiety to success. You can find every episode we've ever made in the app you're using to hear this, where you can also, please, rate and review us, or by heading to the sociologicalreview.org. There you'll also find reading notes for all of our shows, and you can search for the Belief edition of the Sociological Review magazine from May last year, full of pieces that speak to our conversation today. For now, back to Alexis.
Okay, we mentioned at the start that some misunderstandings around spirituality might also be linked to certain preconceptions around religion, right? So we wanted to dig into that here. And to do that, by thinking around this powerful and often misunderstood quote from Marx, that religion is or was the opium of the people. Just take us back there to the 19th century a bit and tell us what he meant.
It's a really interesting question. I wrote a sociology of religion textbook about 10 years ago, and, you have to talk about the kind of the old white dudes, and of course, Karl Marx, and then you've got to talk about the opium of the masses quote, and then you realize that's not what he said, and then when you see the whole quote, understanding the context. And the quote, the full quote is, he says, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." I actually read that through a few times this afternoon and thought it's quite poetic, the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. It's like he's implying some sort of social benefit from religion, and I think he understood that, the enormous importance of religion in the society of which he was coming from, and he was kind of part of an intellectual project that was rejecting religion for more secular and humanist ways of thinking. But my understanding of the way he meant that was that because he was talking about the need for workers to rise up, the need to challenge systems of oppression, and those particular systems of oppression were capitalism. And he would wonder to himself, why isn't there more revolutionary zeal? And one of his critiques was religion is one of the things that saps people's revolutionary zeal because of the promise of like the afterlife. Workers are kind of content with their conditions now, knowing that the great beyond will be more rewarding. And in a sense, because of that, religion is like an opiate, as in soporific. It kind of robs us of what might, advance us and cause us to sort of react and be revolutionary. So I think that's the way he meant it.
Yeah. So there's a sentence that starts before the quote that you read, which is religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. And then what you read comes straight after that. And I find that, fascinating because to me it's like he's saying this is a reaction of people to being oppressed. Like it's, in a way, it's a form of resistance, but it's not leading them to political action, right? So it's not achieving what he wants. And then, of course, today, the way that's taken on meaning today, it's used by those who are very cynical about religion and people of faith to suggest that it's like a sticking plaster or a distraction and things.
But like this is one way in which spirituality gets seen too, right? Like as though it's just a cover for capitalist harm, giving a kind of false comfort, a way to cope with precarity, isolation, perhaps loneliness, alienation, and so on. Do you get that sense from your own work?
One of the books that inspired me that sort of looked at that sort of the dark side of spirituality and how it's sort of co-opted by capitalist interests is Corrett and King's Selling Spirituality, which is this kind of incendiary book written about 15 years ago, just critiquing sort of the corporatization of spiritual practices. And in a way, what incenses me, like when we have workplace change at my university, which seems to be quite common, then they'll say, well, come to a mindful class. And I think that just you've got to wash over these structural problems that are stuffing up universities by I'm just going to sit in my cushion and concentrate on my breathing. And so I think in that way, it just becomes this wishy-washy corporate sort of, whitewash that doesn't empower or change.
Yeah, it's this like that gives us that type of kind of narrative around or kind of analysis around spirituality, makes it seem very kind of apolitical or just kind of flat out commercial, I guess. But there's a take that you can draw from the thought of someone like Foucault, which is to say that it's actually highly political, spirituality, insofar as it's a disciplining practice. Like it's a tool that we use to make ourselves into the good capitalist citizen. And I might add, productive ones when you look at, as you've just said, right, meditation gets taken up across all kinds of different sectors. And that kind of, that is a very political project in and of itself. It might not be the one that we want, but it is nonetheless this kind of political project. Can you reflect on that for us?
One of the interesting things in Andrea Jane's recent work around yoga is that for all of the transformation that people declare that comes from it, there does not seem to be a lot of sort of consequential political transformation. Like there hasn't sort of been a social justice movement to emerge out of the appropriated yoga movement in the global north. And I think that it's a strong critique, but I think it's quite valid. Like I see some kinds of community around my yoga centre, but I don't then see great practices of social justice. That doesn't seem to connect with that. But they're not articulating a narrative of equality and social justice at all. I think they're really valid critiques. Maybe because spirituality is so self-formed, unlike, say, religious movements, which have a kind of strong ethical basis. We collectively agree upon this, and that motivates us to action. Spirituality, because you form it yourself, you decide on what it is. It's kind of like it doesn't necessarily then spring into political action. Maybe, Rosie, I mean, you're much more an expert on that particular thing, but would you say it's more religious communities and the ethical sort of springboard to that?
Oh, I don't know if they're more or not, because I think that there are definitely pretty clear examples of spirituality leading or being kind of certainly being factors in movements for social change. And, environmental activism is kind of the classic example. There are so many spiritual practices that are bound up with that. And, you can have debates about cultural appropriation in those contexts. A lot of the time it's sort of indigenous spiritual practices that get kind of syncretized into different environmental groups. But it's really key. And I mean, there's also what's really interesting, the sort of anti-politics of conspirituality, which I know you've been part of looking at this as well, Andrew. And that's like, I guess that's the flip side of the stuff that I look at. That's people who kind of have these spiritual beliefs, but they're being drawn into these sort of conspiracy networks, anti-vax, QAnon, and they get involved in politics too. Like they protest, they try and enforce, they try and kind of win legislative change, like overturning vaccine mandates and that kind of thing. Like, you can't call that not political. I mean, do you think it's kind of worth talking a bit more about conspirituality and maybe some of the work that you've done on it here, Andrew?
Yeah, my colleague Anna Halifoff led a really amazing project on conspirituality in Australia in the past couple of years, which kind of dovetailed nicely with the COVID epidemic. I guess conspirituality is this sort of this very interesting concept, like a blend of conspiracy theories which exist and have existed for the longest time, that are associated with people who inhabit sort of wellness communities, spiritual communities, new age communities, and then those communities are promoting conspiratorial beliefs, but also with this kind of metaphysical element. And I guess the classic example of COVID is, on the one hand, sort of misinformation about its actual cause and origin. So the conspiracy that it was, part of a global cabal of elites, or it wasn't, its source isn't what you think it is. And if you do your own research, you can understand our secret knowledge. Secret knowledge is very much the kind of spiritual thing. And by the way, the antidote to this kind of global conspiracy to make you unwell is the health and well-being practices that we've got. So not vaccination, but, my activated almonds or whatever will address the conspiracy that is, already stuffing up your life. So very, very interesting social movement. Is it a social movement? I don't want to stray into your area, Rosie, but is it too diffuse to be a social movement? I think maybe QAnon might be, perhaps. I'm not sure.
I think QAnon probably would be, definitely. Yeah. I mean, sociologists of religion debate what spirituality is, and social movement theorists debate what constitutes a social movement. That's a whole other episode.
Hearing you both talk and like this, and it kind of loosely relates to this element of misinformation, but also to what you said earlier about the university employers and kind of like the practices of mindfulness that they hope that we kind of engage in and so on, right? I think that it relates, I guess, to mental health also. So there are like all of these practices around that can be seen as spiritual, right? And are being used by, I guess, employers or life coaches and stuff like that to kind of bring us to manage our emotions more and kind of like work on ourselves more for things that are probably collective problem with the structure of work and so on, right? And that basically just serve to individualize, psychologize, right? The experiences of difficulties that people are experiencing, right? And I guess that also takes the political out of it, the collective out of it. But anyways.
That's a great point, though. It's really very astute. I really agree.
Just to wind back a bit, I'd like to ask you again about like cynicism around spirituality. some of our discussion just now pointed to some of its limitations, and certain practices do seem subject to a degree of mockery. But there are positive things associated with too, yes, like young people being interested in yoga, astrology, or whatever. I wonder if you could elaborate on those kind of like positive aspects and like the gains, perhaps, particularly for young people.
That's really interesting in terms of gain. A lot of the time when you talk to young people who might really be into like tarot or astrology, they often talk about it almost like a form of light entertainment, but just like to bring some intrigue and mystery and wonder into their everyday lives. But I did a project in 2005 on teenagers and spirituality in Australia with some colleagues at the Australian Catholic University, which was a kind of forerunner of our earlier study on spirituality. Our latest study on spirituality. One of the things we looked at was how much young people gave of their time and volunteering and so on. And some of the young people who were really the most into New Age practices were as equally likely as the most religious young people to be engaged in sort of actions towards social justice. That may also be gendered because young women tend to be more attracted to spiritual practices and beliefs than young men. So maybe they care more generally, or maybe it's something about their spiritual practice that generates that. I'm not sure. Is it gender, spiritual practice, or a combination of both? I'm not sure. But yeah, wasn't simply apolitical. It did involve some kind of work towards the common good.
Like you kind of mentioned gender there, Andrew. Like, do you think spirituality is gendered sort of in the way it functions in society?
Oh, totally. So the people who are more likely to practice yoga, meditation, astrology, tarot, more likely to be women than men, young women than young men. And sometimes I wonder if some of that ridicule that is often directed towards spirituality and like eat, pray, love and so on, it's kind of like it's a bit gendered. Mm. I've just done a whole bunch of research about women mediums, spirit mediums in Australia in the early 20th century, and following a couple of really amazing women historians, Alex Roginski and Alana Piper, who looked at sort of how fortune tellers, they were prosecuted by the police. And so also spirit mediums, women, were prosecuted by the police. And it was like because these were women who were empowered, earning an income and having a voice of authority in the case of women spirit mediums, because they were hearing the voices of spirit and communicating. And it just seemed something they were detested and reviled and prosecuted. And dozens of spirit mediums across Australia in the 1920s were, fined by magistrates who disapproved of this practice. And so this kind of putting down of women's spiritual practices, I think, it's an old story. It's a very old story. And I think that some of that continues in the present day.
Well, you've mentioned Eat, Pray, Love, and that's a very good segue into the pop culture section of the show. So this is the bit where we grab a recommendation for something that you've read, seen, listened to, maybe, potentially immersed yourself in, a sound bath, whatever it might be, that you feel speaks to something we've been talking about today. We're going to hold back on our tips and give the floor to you. So, what thing, or maybe a couple of things, would you point us to immerse ourselves in spirituality a little bit more?
So, I'm a Generation X male, so I'm a sucker for podcasts. And I like to listen to ones that are about all kinds of wacky and weird things. One I really enjoyed is a podcast called The Dream by an American podcaster called Jay Marie. And she did a really great, she's done a few seasons of The Dream, but the second season of The Dream is about the wellness industry in the United States and I guess how that bleeds into women's interests and about empowerment and about capitalism and spirituality. Highly recommended The Dream, season 1, 2 and 3, but in particular season 2.
Great. Thank you very much. Andrew, we've really enjoyed talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Rose.
And that's it for this month. We're back in January when our guest will be the sociolegal scholar Sweta Balakrishnan.
Until then, please share us far and wide with students, friends, family, and remember to check out everything else the Sociological Review has to offer, from our other podcasts, including Spatial Delight, inspired by the geographer Doreen Massey, to our magazine, each edition on a different theme. You'll find all that and more over at thesociologicalreview.org.
Thanks to our producer Alice Block and our sound engineer David Crackles. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.